Fans of Egyptian mythology may be aware of the famous rivalry between the gods Horus and Seth. Seth is often portrayed as the villain, as the evil uncle who steals the Egyptian throne by murdering his brother Osiris, whereas Horus is the hero who battles against his uncle in order to rightfully reclaim his throne. The psychological significance of this myth is hard to overstate because it appears to be one of the earliest depictions of the individuation process. And so it depicts psychological processes which are in motion within every single individual person. And it's probably for this reason why the myth was so widely revered and why we still have it today. But what if I told you that this myth wasn't only a psychological story, but rather a historical one? That this mythological rivalry actually has its origins in a real war that was fought between Horus and Seth, all the way back to the earliest days of Egyptian history, way before the pyramids were even built. And yes, I mean this literally. There was a real conflict between these two gods. And if that concept confuses you, please check out the latest video which I published because it puts forth some notions which are instrumental in order for understanding what's going on in this video. Because in that video, I explained how Horus, and indeed all of the ancient gods which we see in history, can be regarded as real, causally effective entities who were responsible for the earliest events in Egyptian history. In this video, I'm going to tell the story of how Horus became the first king of a unified Egyptian kingdom, as well as the story of how another god named Seth attempted to usurp his kingdom. The evidence for this coup is really interesting, and it involves piecing together some clues in order to paint a picture of what must have happened. However, before I tell you that story, I'm going to have to switch shirts because I have an announcement. I have a sponsor for this video, and don't worry, it's not like NordVPN or Raid Shadow Legends. Is Raid Shadow Legends still sponsoring videos? I haven't seen one of their commercials in a while. But the sponsor is actually the work of a self-published author who reached out to me and was kind enough to give me a glimpse into the world that he's created. In Grasshopper Sharpshooter, you're introduced to a world unlike anything I've ever seen. The complicated mythology of this world is just so next level and so ambitious that there were many times where I felt this sense of just sheer profoundness. It kind of felt like the author had somehow escaped Samsara and then decided to rejoin it in order to tell us what it was like. So please consider checking out Grasshopper Sharpshooter. This is a self-published author, and so he doesn't have the benefit of having a big publisher backing him up. But I'm happy to represent his work here because I think it's really cool. And so I hope you'll consider getting lost in the world that he's created. So the story begins on the Nile River, where for thousands of years, people have been settling and using the periodic flooding of the Nile in order to grow crops. The banks of the Nile became dotted with numerous city-states, roughly divided between Upper Egypt in the south, because it was up on the Nile River, and Lower Egypt in the north. These cities were unlike anything which had existed in the past, each with a distinct culture and a unique pantheon of gods. And these cities hosted populations of up to thousands of individuals, which at that point was utterly unprecedented for the human species. As was explained in the last video, these cities were all held together by collective hallucinatory entities known as gods. And so each city was ruled by a major god alongside a pantheon of lesser deities. And some of these gods would later rise to prominence as very significant gods of ancient Egypt, including Hathor, Sobek, Ra, Khnum, and Thoth. The worship of these different gods may reflect the unique cultures of these different peoples before they became unified. Noteworthy among the Lower Egyptian deities was Ptah, lord of the city of Memphis, which would later become the capital of the unified Egypt, and Neith, queen of the city of Sais, indicating that goddesses could also be rulers of these cities. In Upper Egypt, the cow goddess Bat held the position of the queen of the city of Seshesh, while the falcon god Horus was the lord of the city of Nekhen, which was later renamed Hierakonpolis, or City of the Falcon. Also noteworthy is that the city of Nakada was likely ruled by the god Seth. Now, at this time, Horus was an aggressive war god symbolized by the falcon, and he wished to spread his influence all across the land. It's likely that temples dedicated to Horus began cropping up in other cities as his worship became more widespread. While Horus originated from the city of Nekhen, as far as we can tell, he either founded or conquered the city of Edfu, because this also appears to be one of his major cities. And it was from these two major cities that he ordered his followers to begin the conquest of all of Upper Egypt. But he could not do so alone. Horus appears to have formed an alliance with the cow goddess Bat, queen of the city of Seshesh, which was likely home to a cattle-rearing community which venerated cows. thus explaining why they worshipped a cow goddess. We know that this alliance existed because both Horus and Bat are depicted on the Narmr palette as the conquerors of Egypt. It could be that Bat submitted to Horus early on in his conquest, or that the two gods sought an alliance with each other. But in either case, they were allied to each other during the wars against the other cities of Egypt. The warlike culture of Nekhen, represented by the falcon, and the cattle-rearing culture of Sheshesh, represented by the goddess Bat, were merged together, and both cities likely benefited from this union. Just take a moment to think about how fascinating this is. These gods were hallucinatory entities emerging from the minds of their followers, and yet they appeared to be relatively intelligent and capable of sophisticated behavior. Horus wasn't out to simply replace all other gods and establish himself as the sole deity. Instead, he was willing to form unions with other gods and let other gods be worshipped in their respective cities. From an archetypal perspective, the union of Bat and Horus could represent a kind of proto-unification of masculine and feminine, which is how a single person could accommodate several gods within their minds, and take orders from all of them. Horus sought to become king, not just over the people of Egypt, but also over all of the other gods of Egypt. And so he would let other gods be worshipped in other cities so long as they submitted to his ultimate authority. And so Horus, alongside his ally Bat, who commanded a huge army, eventually conquered every city in Upper Egypt. Around this time, we know that Lower Egypt was also unified. Which god was responsible for the unification? Unfortunately, we don't seem to know. There isn't enough evidence to say that it was any god in particular who ruled over all of Lower Egypt. One possibility is that it was Ptah, because Ptah was lord of the city of Memphis, which was one of the more significant cities in that region. But it could also have been a different god, or it could even have been a situation where there was an alliance between all of the different gods of Lower Egypt, and they were more or less equal to each other. Again, we don't know exactly, but hopefully more archaeological evidence will emerge which will paint a better picture of which god must have been ruling Lower Egypt at that time. Regardless of what was going on, the fierce divine falcon harbored ambitions to conquer all of Egypt. And I guess he wasn't simply satisfied with ruling over the south. And so he and his allies attacked Lower Egypt as well. His relentless desire for dominance drove him to conquer all of the cities of the north. It's likely that prior to his conquest, Horus's influence was already spreading in the north, because many temples dedicated to Horus began cropping up in this region. And from his cult centers, he commanded his worshippers to wage war against the other gods of Egypt, all of whom eventually submitted. This was the founding of the Great Kingdom of Ancient Egypt, and this significant event was commemorated by the Narmr palette, a magnificent artifact which was discovered in Nekhen, and Nekhen was the original center of Horus's worship. The palette shows the chief priest of Horus, Narmr, bashing in this guy's brains. It also shows Horus binding this strange-looking man with rope. And it's thought that these weird mushroom things protruding out of his back are a representation of the different cities across the Nile. So what this is really saying is that Horus was responsible for subjugating all of the different cities of the Nile and tying them together. We also see Bat in several places to indicate her significant role in bringing all of this about. Horus's successful conquest made him the first king of Egypt. And yes, Horus was the first king, not Narmr, because from the ancient Egyptians' perspective, Narmr was just an emissary of Horus. Keeping in mind that Horus and Narmr were two entities contained within the same body. And so it really depends on how you want to look at it, but I think from the ancient Egyptian perspective, they regarded Horus as the true king, because from their perspectives, the gods were very much real. From this point on, Horus became permanently associated with the kingship of Egypt. As we discussed last time, Horus was featured in the Syriacs of all subsequent rulers of Egypt, with one major exception, which we'll discuss later. But the fact that Horus is shown so prominently in these Syriacs again speaks to the fact that he was the true ruler of Egypt and his servant or his priest was subordinate to him. And we can look at these different Syriacs. Here's the Syriac for the third ruler of the dynasty, whose name means defender of Horus. And here's the Syriac for the fourth ruler, whose name means serpent of Horus, which again is my favorite. These priests were the primary intermediaries between gods and men. In other words, they were shamanic priests. And they were tasked with communicating with the gods and carrying out the gods' orders. And at this time, Horus was chief amongst all of the gods. However, many other priests were employed to communicate with the other gods of Egypt as well, usually by interacting with statues depicting these gods and performing these very elaborate ceremonies in front of these statues in order to appease the gods and in order to encourage the gods to speak back to them. Because remember, each city was still technically ruled by the tutelary deity. Interestingly, to help consolidate his position, Horus appears to have formed a strategic alliance with the goddess Neith, who was ruler of the city of Sais. The union itself may have been a divine marriage between Horus and Neith, and the evidence for this comes from the fact that several chief priests of Horus were married to priestesses of Neith. Narmr himself may have been married to a woman named Nathotep, whose name means beloved of Neith. And here's something really fascinating. One of these priestesses of Neith, named Merneith, temporarily ruled as queen regent until her son was old enough, which means that for a time, Neith, rather than Horus, was the ruler of Egypt. The capital city of Egypt was eventually changed to Memphis, where the original ruling god was Ptah. However, Horus seems to not have supplanted Ptah as a ruler over the city. Instead, Ptah retained his status as the Lord of Memphis. Yet Memphis served as the seat of Horus's authority over all of Egypt. This is basically a situation where Ptah was considered almost like the mayor of the city, but being the capital city, Horus was the ruler over all of Egypt, operating out of that capital city. And evidence supporting this coexistence between Ptah and Horus is found in the continued service of the high priest of Ptah in the city. This high priest served a significant role as an official serving the king. Now, Horus, being a war god and a conqueror, also attempted to spread his influence outside of Egypt. As part of this expansion, numerous cult centers dedicated to Horus were established in Nubia, which is the kingdom to the south of Egypt, which is modern-day Sudan. However, within Horus's realm, his shamanic priests often found themselves entangled in power struggles to secure the position of the chief priest. And such internal strife was common in the ruling dynasties of a vast kingdom like Egypt. And eventually, the first dynasty, which was founded by Narmr, was overthrown and a second dynasty was established. And yet, despite that, Horus was still the ruler of Egypt. It was just that a different family of priests had replaced the old family. And so Horus remained the permanent leader of Egypt, even though his emissary could be replaced. However, there was a brief period where this changed. The god Seth was a very ancient god, and references to him can be found dating all the way back to proto-historic times. The animal represented by him is not known for sure. It could be an aardvark, or it could even be an extinct animal. Originally, Seth was the god of the Upper Egyptian city of Nakada, which was conquered by Horus during his campaign to seize all of Upper Egypt. However, during the Second Dynasty, Seth may have temporarily usurped the throne from Horus as an act of revenge. To do this, he recruited a man named Peribsen to be his emissary. We don't know exactly who Peribsen was, because again, we're talking about things that happened way back in the past. He may have been a member of the Second Dynastic family, who turned away from Horus and aligned himself with Seth, eventually becoming the chief priest of Seth. But he may have also been an opportunistic outsider. Regardless of his origins, by following the commands of his god Seth, Peribsen orchestrated a coup and seized control of the Egyptian kingship. This seizure of power marked Seth's brief rule over Egypt. And the evidence for this is rather remarkable because it's reflected in Peribsen's divine name, which departed from the customary inclusion of Horus and instead bore the name of Seth. And you can see this visible in Peribsen's Sarik, where Seth has replaced Horus. Hence, Peribsen's divine name was Seth Peribsen, indicating that divine authority had shifted during this unique period. So Seth was ruler of Egypt for a time, but Horus being Horus wasn't about to let this upstart seize control of his kingdom. The still loyal followers of Horus maintained control in Lower Egypt, while the followers of Seth held sway in Upper Egypt. This division led to a brief civil war as the two factions vied for dominance. Ultimately, it appears that the followers of Horus emerged victorious and reclaimed control. The subsequent king after Peribsen, Kasekemwe, adopted a Sarik name that incorporated both Horus and Seth, signaling the reunification of the kingdom. This is interesting because this joint Sarik name indicated that both Horus and Seth were co-rulers of Egypt. symbolizing a resolution to the internal conflict that had temporarily divided Egypt. But this brief state of reunification in the Second Dynasty did not last, as a different family of Horus followers had seized the throne. This is a very common theme in Egypt. There were like 25 dynasties, probably more. And so it occurred over and over again that a different family would seize control of the Egyptian throne. But this third family restored Horus to the position of sole ruler of Egypt. They likely took advantage of the chaos of the recent civil war to do so. And in this third dynasty, Seth would never appear again in the Sarik names. And from that point on, it would always be Horus. And it is this conflict which appears to be the origins of the famous mythological rivalry between these two gods. Something which happened in the deep, ancient past somehow still echoed thousands of years later, which is utterly remarkable. The ancient Egyptians imbued this myth with significant symbolism, using it to elevate the stature of the king. Moreover, it served as a symbolic representation of the political situation in Egypt, which was often divided between Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And these two halves experienced frequent divisions and reunifications. And so from this moment on, Seth was generally reviled in ancient Egypt. And he was seen as a god of evil and malevolence, and often had many characteristics of the trickster archetype, or even of the shadow archetype. And he was a god who often used Egypt's enemies against Egypt, in an ambitious desire to once again become king. However, this negative association with evil did not completely eradicate the worship of Seth throughout Egypt. And especially in his original cities, some Egyptians continue to revere him. Now, with the founding of the Third Dynasty, we commence what historians have called the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And it would rise to significance largely due to the huge pyramids that it was responsible for constructing. And this is really where Egyptian history begins. So far, we've been talking about the prelude to Egyptian history. And yet, as you can see, the prelude was highly significant. So this was the story of the rise of Horus and his battle against Seth to reclaim his throne and become the sole ruler of Egypt. I hope you found this story interesting, because I certainly do, and the archaeological evidence for it is just so fascinating, and it's amazing that it survived long enough for us to be able to piece this story together. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Hope you have a great day, and may good luck always come your way.